We got up to Daf Lamed Gimel Lamed Beis yesterday towards the bottom of the Amud, and if you'll count up from the bottom, approximately 10 lines, you'll see a line that starts with My Shna. The Gemara wants to understand when they split up Hatovas and Neros, and there had to be a hefsek, an interruption in the middle. Why did they do Hatov on 5 Neros and then the last 2 Neros? Aishna di Ovid Hatovas Chamesh Neros Beresha. They began with 5 Neros, and then afterwards another 2 to complete the count of 7. Navid, why not do it in another way? Hatovas Shtei Neros Beresha. Start with 2 Neros, and then you do what's called a Dam HaTamid, and after that interruption for the Dam HaTamid, they could do Hatova on the last 5 Neros. And the Gemara answers, Kevan the Aschil Bahu, once he began with Hatovas HaNeros, Ovid Ruba, he should implement a Hatova on a large representation of Neros that is Rov. Whenever we start a mitzvah, even if we know that we'll have to take an interruption, we try to accomplish as much as possible with that mitzvah. And to demonstrate that, we're going to do the Hatova of 5 Neros. It could have been 4 and 3 to get to the number 7, but we want to have a very prominent majority of 5. Tomorrow later on is going to ask why not 6 and 1, but right now we're holding 5 and 2. And that's called Tchila. That's the way we begin the mitzvah. Now this, according to the Siach Yitzchak, one of the commentaries on Yoma, is another expression, another application of the principle called Ein Ovrim Ala Mitzvahs, which means that when we have the opportunity to fulfill a mitzvah, we maximize and try to accomplish as much of the mitzvah as possible. So if that be the case, that leads us into the hands of the next question, the Navid Shis. You want to do the maximum, you need a break for the Dam HaTamid, so then do 6 and leave yourself the one last Ner, and that would be the Hatova of Ner Echad. Gemara says, no, there is no such thing as Hatova of 1 Ner. Amar Kra, the Torah ups the ante on what constitutes a Hatova, Maisa Hatova. It says, Bativo es haneros yaktirenu. With regard to Hatova, the Torah deliberately uses the plural form of neros to indicate that ein neros tchusos mishtayim. Whenever the Torah uses a plural, the minimum of a plural is always shtayim. So the Torah is telling us behetivo, when you're doing Hatova, it's got to be neros. 1 ner is not Hatova. So the chashivus of Hatova is achieved when you do a minimum of 2 neros of Hatova. So therefore, there's no option other than to set up the post Dam HaTamid Hatova is at least 2 neros. The first, which is the pre-Dam HaTamid, we should maximize, as we said before, because ain't over in al mitzvahs, and therefore we'll do the Hatova on 5 neros. At this point, we go back to Abaye. Abaye is giving us the Seder Maracha. We now have completed the entire process of Hatovas HaNeros. That began with 5 Neros. We took a break for the Dam HaTamid, and we shechted and we zorik the Dam HaTamid. Now we did the Hatova on the last 2 Neros. What next? Hatova shtei neros kodemes l'ktoros. Next on line is the ktoros. Yomar Kra, the pasuk says in the 30th chapter of Shmos with regard to Hadlokas HaNeros, it says by Tivo es HaNeros v'hodar, and immediately afterwards Yakti Rena. What's Yakti Rena? doesn't seem to hook into the beginning of the pasuk of Hatavas Haneros, unless we interpret Yaktirena as Haktoras Haktores. But it's interesting, in the sequence of the psukim, we first have Hatavas Haneros, and then Yaktirena Haktoras Haktores. Then Abai says, what comes after the Ktores? Ktores, we'll add the word Kodemes, le'evarim. Now, what do you mean by evarim? After all, the avodas hadam, shchita, kabbalah, zrika, etc., was done for the Talmud in between the hatava of 5 neros and the last hatava of 2 neros. Now you're telling me, after the hatava of the last 2 neros, we've completed hatava, now you mark to the Ktores. What comes after the Ktores? You're talking about evarim? Haven't we already achieved evarim? The answer is no. We're going to split the avodas hatamid into 2 fundamentally different parts. Part number 1 is the avodas hadam, which begins with shchita and ends with zrika. Now we have a different avodah, and that's haktoras ha'emurim. That means to burn on the mizbeach, those parts of the Talmud, which is basically the entire balance of the Talmud, because we're talking about a carbon ola. In a carbon ola, everything goes up in smoke, and that Haktorah will take place after he completes Hatava and Haktoras Haktores. Tisanya, as we learned in the Brisa, Yukdam Davar Shenemar Bo Baboker Baboker. How do we know that the Ketorah should come before the Evarim of the Karban Talmud? After all, you've already started the mitzvah of Karban Talmud with the Avodas Hadam. Okay, you completed the Atava. Why are you jumping over the Ketoris? Why not stick to the Dam of the Karban of Talmud and finish the Talmud? Why are you wedging Ketores and giving it precedence before the Talmud, before the Evarim of the Talmud that need a Ketorah on the Mizbeach? And the Gemara answers, because what we have in Haktoras Haktores is the word Baboker twice. Now, the word Baboker in and of itself means early. We're going to see later, in contrast, is the word Hayom. Hayom means later in the day. But Baboker means as early as possible. In the Torah, it says the word Baboker twice. And this is in Shmos Perek Lamed, Baboker Bativo Saneros Yakti Rena. And we interpreted Yakti Rena as a reference to Haktoras Haktores. And on that, the Torah says Baboker. Therefore, that gives sequential preference to Haktoras above and beyond the Evarim of the Talmud. The word Boker, with regard to the Evarim of the Talmud, appears only once. And that's a pasuk in Shmos Perek Chaf Tes. It says, "Es hakeves hached taseh ba boker." Right? We're very familiar with that pasuk because we read it on Rosh Chodesh. So the Evarim of the Talmud are included in the word ba boker, but there's no repetition of the word ba boker. So Ketores, which has ba boker, must be earlier than the Evarim of the Talmud, where it only has one ba boker. Now, here I have a very important footnote that I wanted to share with you. The word Baboker appears once with regard to the Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. And it's very interesting because since the word Baboker appears in Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, and we don't need it in that context, as we discussed yesterday, we're going to use it in terms of the Talmud. In an Eino Inyan, we lift the word Baboker from the parsha of Shnei Gizri Eitzim and place it down in the parsha of the Korban Tamid. Now the Korban Tamid says, as Hakevas Echad Taseh Baboker, so we have one Baboker. Now we're grafting another Baboker from the parsha of Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. Now the Tamid has 2 times Baboker. So why does the Gemara insist that the bringing of the Korban Tamid will have to wait until after the Ketores, because Ketores says Baboker twice, and Tamid only says once, but that's not really true. We have 2 times Baboker. We have the indigenous Baboker in the parsha of the Tamid, and that's in the pasuk of Esakevas Taseh Baboker. Now we have another Baboker that we're borrowing and grafting onto Tamid from Shnei Gizrei Eitzim. So at the end of the day in Tamid we have 2 Babokers. Why does Ketores in its Baboker come first before the Tamid? So on this we have a Ritva. And he says the following, that the Torah, instead of writing Baboker twice with regard to the Tamid, it gave us a hint to a second Baboker from the parsha of Shnei Gizrei Eitzim, but it's not local. And therefore, what the Torah is trying to tell me is that on the one hand, Tamid has this element of Baboker, that it should be early. On the other hand, it's not all that, it's not cracked up to be a second Baboker. We're going to borrow the second Baboker. So where are we going to fit this in, and how are we going to apply this? And the answer is that one Baboker is going to refer to the dam of the Tamid. And that's going to give me an equation between the dam of the Tamid and the Ketores. I'm sorry, and the Hatovas Haneros, I meant to say. And therefore, what we're going to do is right? It says Bativo. Just get the pasuk. Baboker Bativo es Haneros. We have a double Baboker with regard to Neros. On the other hand, in the parsha of Korban Tamid, it also says Baboker. As we said over and over again, Es Hakeves Echad Taseh Baboker. But it's not a double Baboker. So that one single Baboker is going to tell me to somehow push up the Tamid into the framework of Hatovas Haneros. So what we're going to do is we're going to interrupt the Hatovas Haneros somewhere in the middle or after the majority. And now we're going to fulfill the Baboker of the Dama Tamid. But the Torah didn't add the second Baboker explicitly in the parsha of Tamid. Therefore, the second Baboker is going to reflect on a different dimension of the Korban Tamid, namely the Eivarim. But here, since we're in a borrowed Baboker, it's going to have to give way to the second Baboker of the Ketores, because the pasuk says by Tivos Neros Yakti Renu in Boker Baboker. So therefore, the Ketores is going to come before the actual Haktorah of the Eivarim of the Tamid. So he says the following. Why did the Torah not choose to write the word Tamid explicitly in the parsha of Tamid? The second Baboker was left as a borrowed or grafted Baboker. He says, Nichtav Baboker Hasheni begizrei eitzim v'yonu matilin oso al hatamid kedei natilo rak al hachoshev al hachoshuv shebein havodos. Slightly different than what I said. He said that the second baboker, which we're borrowing from Shnei Gizrei Eitzim and imposing on the parsha of Tamid, tells me that there's another din of kedima of a second baboker with regard to the Tamid, but we don't know which aspect of the Tamid. So we're going to focus on the most important, the most prominent aspect of the avodas hatamid, hachoshev bein avodos, v'hainu zrikas hadam. So the zrikas hadam will come before the haktoras, and even before we complete the mitzvah of hatovas haneros. However, Nevarim, that already goes down the line and it comes after the Ketores. And as we said, with regard to the Ketores, the Torah repeats the word baboker. You have it twice. Now what comes next on the list? We have burnt the Avarim of the Tamid on the H, on the Marocha, and now we're ready for the Mincha, because a carbon Tamid has to be accompanied, as insofar as it's a carbon Ola, by Nesachim and by a carbon Mincha. Tanya, we learned to the Brisa, Minayin shelo yeh davar kodem litamid shel shachar. How do we know that the opening avoda on any given day in the Beis Hamikdash is going to be the Tamid Shel Shachar, and there will be nothing that is burnt on the Mizbeach in the Marocha Gdolah Mizbeach before the Tamid Shel Shachar? Talmud Loma, we're going to derive this from a pasuk in Vayikra Vav. Ubir Oleh Kohen Eitzim Baboker Baboker V'Arach Oleha Ha'ola. Let's emphasize the word Oleha. Omar Rava Ha'ola He Ola Rishona. And the Hay of Ha'ola is called a Hay Hayidiyah. And that is upgrading the status of this Ola, namely Carbon Tamid. That Hi Ola Rishona, the Hay means Harishona. The first thing in any given day that's going to be placed on the Eish, on the Maroch and the Mizbeach, is the Carbon Tamid Shel Shachar. Now, it's interesting. The Tosfos Yeshanim points out that if you take a look in the Parsha of Karbanos at the end of Sefer Bamidbar, you'll see that on the list of all the Karbanos, the first on the list is the Carbon Tamid. So when it says Ha'ola with a Hey Ayidiyah as a reference to the Olas HaTamid, because we know that it's got to be Ha'ola has to be indicative of the Carbon Tamid, because the Carbon Tamid was mentioned first in the Parsha of Karbanos. Okay, and now what we have is the Carbon Mincha of the Tamid Shel Shachar. The Mincha of the Tamid Shel Shachar. Now, the Tamid Shel Shachar as a Carbon Ola needs not just a Mincha, it needs the Nesachim. And you and I would have anticipated that immediately after the Mincha, about which the Torah says V'Arach Oleha Ola, we should find that we should anticipate the Nisachim. But Abai says no. What comes after the Carbon Mincha? The Mincha that accompanies the Tamid is the Chavitin Shel Kohen Gadol. And the Gemara quotes two words of a longer pasuk to derive the chavitin shel kohen gadol. We'll read the whole pasuk. It's in Parshas Emor. It says, "Lakriv ishel Hashem, ola umincha, zevach unesachim, dvar yom biyom." Now watch what's unique about this pasuk. We have ola, and then we have mincha. The ola comes before the mincha, and this teaches us that the mincha is going to be brought right after the ola satamid, immediately. There should be nothing that would interrupt the chavitim. Right? So lo yafsiku chavitim bein ola leminchas hatamid. So we're going to derive from ola umincha that the mincha has to be attached to the korban itself. Korban, meaning the ola of Tamid Shel Shachar, and then immediately the mincha that accompanies the ola. That's called ola u mincha. So that you and I might have suggested that the chavita of the Kohen Gadol is a very, very important korban mincha, and it should come before the mincha of the Tamid. So I have now a head-on collision. What should come first? The mincha that accompanies the Tamid, or the mincha which is called the chavitin of the Kohen Gadol? And the Kohen Gadol is going to have to take a back seat. Why is that? Because the Torah says ola u mincha, meaning that the mincha has to be attached immediately after the ola, after the Tamid. No room to delay it by bringing the asiras ha'efa, the chavitin of the Kohen Gadol. Okay, but now, where are the nesachim that have to accompany the korban tamid? Chavitin l'nesachim. The yayin that we're going to use as a libation to accompany the korban tamid will have to wait until after the chavitin. How do we know that? It just gives us two words: shum mincha. So if you'll take a look in the commentaries here, based on Rashi, they add the following. Nemar, it says in the pasuk by Yikra Vav, asiris ha'efa. We're talking now about the minchas kohen gadol, the chavitim. Soles mincha tamid. Now, from the fact that the Torah uses the word tamid, or shall I say minchas tamid, that phrase, in the context of asiris ha'efa, which is the chavitim, the kohen gadol, it means that the chavitim of Kohen Gadol are attached to the minchas hatamid, which doesn't allow us to bring the nesachim that accompany the tamid, because those are niskei tamid, they are not minchas tamid. So the minchas hatamid will have to be brought even before the chavitim. But then immediately after the minchas hatamid, we're ready for the chavitim. Why? Because the chavitim are described as mincha tamid. Right after the korban tamid, that's when we're going to bring the mincha of the Kohen Gadol, which is called chavitim. Even though, again, it's a break between the Minchas HaTamid and the Niskei HaTamid. But it doesn't matter. Why? Because Shum Mincha. What does that mean, Shum Mincha? It means that there's one continuous Mincha. It's the Minchas HaTamid, and then there's the Mincha of Chavitin Shel Kohen Gadol. That's also called a Mincha. And again, the pasuk says, "Hasiris ha'efo," referring to the Chavita, the Kohen Gadol, soles mincha tamid. The Torah is calling it a mincha. Now, again, we'd have to learn a lot to figure out exactly what din and what regulations govern the Chavitin of the Kohen Gadol. Is it really a mincha? It sounds like a mincha because it's soles. But on the other hand, it's an accompaniment to the carbon of the tamid. Maybe that's certain dinim of the carbon tamid. Unesachim says Abai lemusaf. Here's where we move on to the next stage. The nesachim are the clincher, the very last stage in the tamid. What comes after the carbon tamid? You could have the Darban and Davis, but what if it's a Shabbos or it's a Yontif, and we have a Chiyuv Musafim? We're going to bring the Musafim right after the Tamid is complete. When is the Tamid complete? The culmination of the process of the Tamid is the Nesachim, the Niskei Yayin that accompany the Tamid. Now we're ready for Musafim. Wait a second. I'm not ready for the Musafim. I'm ready for the Lechem HaPanim. The Lechem HaPanim are a basic integral avodah on Shabbos. Why are you stretching your arm out to Musafim when we're still involved in the Lechem HaPanim? I mean, why do you stretch your arm out to Musafim, I meant to say, when we're still involved in the Lechem HaPanim? What do I mean? What do I mean by the Lechem HaPanim? We've said over and over again, the Lechem HaPanim has two parts to it. One are the 12 loaves of bread on the shulchan. And then we have the Levona. The Levona has to be brought on the Mizbeach. It's Haktoras HaLevona. So in effect, we haven't finished the day's avoda on the Mizbeach until after we complete the Lechem HaPanim, and specifically the Haktoras HaLevona. And now you want to jump the gun and you want to introduce the avoda of Musafim. I mean, Musafim are, additional to the karbanos, but I would say that Shabbos itself generates a chiyuv of levona. You may remember that when we learned Perek Makom Shenagu in Psachim, we had a long discussion about what's called bezichin. Bezichin are the spoons that are used to take the levona from the shulchan and bring it over to the mizbeach. And we had a whole discussion. What comes first, bezichin or musafim? Abai seems to indicate that musafim comes first, and then the bezichin, which, if I remember correctly, I have to do a chazara, but that was the shita Rabbi Shmuel. Rabbi Akiva had it the other way around, that the bezichin come before the musafim. So Abai says musafim before bezichin. So the Gemara right away asks, for Asanya we have a brayso bezichin kodem lemusafim, and the Gemara answers Tanoi. This is a machlokas Tanoi. between Rabbi Yishmael and Rabbi Akiva, recorded in the Gemara Pesachim Nun Ches. And who holds what? Oh, so I have to perhaps scratch what I said to you before. Rabbi Yishmael holds that Musafim. Oh, that's good. That's what we said. That Musafim come first. So when it says in Abaye, Musafim, and then Bezichim, that reflects the sheet of Rabbi Yishmael that the Musaf comes before the Lechem upon it. Rabbi Akiva holds that Bezichim code. And I think if I remember correctly, we said that the logic that compels Rabbi Akiva is that Musafim should be delayed because of the word Hayom. So let's push the Musafim till the end of the morning. The morning ends, let's call it 11 o'clock on our clock, 11 a.m. Once you finish the Avodas HaTamid, which is clinched with the Niskei, the Nesachim, and the Tamid, it's not yet 11 o'clock, and it's not time for the Musafim. So Rabbi Akiva says, now we should bring the Bazichin, the Lechem upon it. When the Gemara says Tanoihi, the Gemara is defending Abai by saying that Abai is legitimately accepting the Shita of Rabbi Shmuel, and he's rejecting the Shita of Rabbi Akiva. And now Abaye waves the flag, and he says, Omar Abai Mistabra, the logic compels me, Kimandi Omar, like the opinion of Rabbi Shmuel, that Musafim Kodmin Libazichin. And why should the Musaf come before Bazichin? And the answer is, Lav mi amrit baboker lahaktim, hachanami biyom bayom liacher. And he says the following about it. We have two polar extremes. We have the word boker, and especially if the Torah repeats the word boker a second time, baboker, that means early, early. And then we have hayom, which indicates that we postpone it. On the other end of the polar extreme, the other end of the scale. Now, in the parsha of Bazichim, it says the word bayom twice. Biyom hashabbos yarichena. In the context of the Bazichim, and this is in Parshas Emor, the Torah uses the double language of Biyom, and that's called Liacher. Whereas Baboker means ala boker, lahaktin. So where it says Baboker, and that's in the parsha of what? Of Musafim. There we're going to give it an earlier time period, whereas as far as Bezichin is concerned, it says bayom, and that means liacher, to delay it. He adds a comment here in the name of Rashi that liacher means that bayom mashma bi'itzumo shel yom, v'lo baboker. That's the meaning of the word bayom. And we're almost at the end of the sukkah. My time of demand the Yomer Bezichin Kodmil Musafim. After all, we have to defend Rabbi Akiva, the great Rabbi Akiva. He wants the Bezichin to come before the Musafim. And yet, this seems to be in conflict with our principle that Baboker, in its flip side of bayom means liacher. And if it's liacher, then since in the parsha of Bazichim, it says hayom bayom, Therefore, it should come after the Musafim. Why does Rabbi Akiva insist that the Musafim come first? I'm sorry, that the Bazichin come first. So now the Gemara introduces a Gzeira Shava, which we didn't have until now. Like time of the Mandiora Bazichin called Mila Musafim, Gomar Chuka Chuka Michavitim. In the Parsha of Chavitim Vayikra Vav, it says Chak Olam Lashem Kolil Tiktar Taktar. In Bazichin, that's in Perikav Dalit, Kodesh Kadoshim Hu Chak Olam. Once again, the identical two words, Chak Olam. And from this Gzeira Shava, we're going to determine, or derive, I should say, that just like Chavitim come before Musafim, as we discussed earlier, so too Bazichin come before Musafim. So the Gemara asks, Ime Hasam Gomar, is Ligmei Kule Milsa Mehasam? Why don't we derive all the dinim, whether it's Bazichin, whether it's Chavitim, and we should say that just like Chavitim come before Nesachim, so too Bazichin should come before Nesachim. So the Gemara is asking, Madua Heim Kodmim Rak Lemutsafim? Why do we say the Chavitim come right before the Musafim? Why not say that the Chavitim should come before the Nesachim? And the Bazichin should also come before the Nesachim, because according to Rabbi Akiva, we have a Gzeira Shava between Bazichin, Chak Olam, and Musafim Chak Olam. So the Gemara answers, Lahachi Ahani Biyom Liacher. In other words, to derive the conclusion that Bazichin are after the Nesachim, for that we're going to use the fact that not once but twice in the Parsha Bazichin does the Torah use the word Bayom, and that emphasizes Liacher. So even though we derive with the Gzeira Shava from Chavitim Lahaktim es HaBazichin LeMusafim, but nevertheless we're going to derive from Bayom that Bazichin come after the Nesachim. So this is where we're going to stop on the top of Daf Lamed Daled Amud Aleph, Ketores Shel Shachar, which is really not so much on the top; it's actually in the middle of the Amud. So I'll just wish you all a meaningful day, and I was thinking, I don't know if this is Eisgehalten, as we say in Yiddish, but if you daven b'tzibur and you could say Kaddish, even if you don't have a yortzeit, say Kaddish for so many of the people who died, especially during the Tafshin Chaf, the Milchemet HaShechrur, many of them died, and there was no one afterwards to say Kaddish. Because that was, after World War II, after the Holocaust. So maybe to have in mind a special Kaddish for those who have no one saying Kaddish. We'll get together Mitzvah Shem tomorrow. Thank you so much.